The frozen Delaware River stretched before them like a ribbon of death, its icy surface reflecting the pale winter moon of December 25th, 1770. General George Washington stood at the bow of the lead boat, his weathered hands gripping the sides as chunks of ice crashed against the hull with thunderous echoes that seemed to mock their desperate mission. Behind him, 2,400 Continental soldiers huddled in overcrowded vessels, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the bitter air that cut through their ragged uniforms like invisible knives. Washington's piercing blue eyes surveyed the treacherous crossing, knowing that this moment would either resurrect the dying embers of American independence or extinguish them forever. The Continental Army had suffered a devastating string of defeats throughout the autumn of 1776, retreating across New Jersey like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Morale had plummeted to depths that threatened to shatter the very foundation of the revolutionary cause. With desertions mounting daily and enlistments set to expire with the new year, the general's mind raced with the weight of impossible odds. As his soldiers struggled against the relentless current, intelligence reports had confirmed that Hessian forces under Colonel Johann Gottlob Raoul occupied Trenton, their discipline and military prowess legendary throughout European battlefields. These were not militia farmers or untested recruits, but professional soldiers who had honed their craft through decades of continental warfare. Yet Washington understood that conventional wisdom had become the enemy of survival, and only audacious action could salvage their cause from the jaws of defeat. According to historical accounts, documented in David Hackett Fisher's Washington's Crossing, the crossing took nearly 9 hours to complete, with soldiers battling hypothermia and equipment failures that threatened to doom the mission before it began. The general himself nearly fell into the icy waters when his boat struck a massive ice floe, saved only by the quick reflexes of his aide-de-camp who grabbed his coat at the last moment. As dawn approached on December 26th, Washington's forces finally reached the Pennsylvania shore, their clothes frozen solid and their weapons coated with ice that would need to be cleared before battle. Many soldiers left bloody footprints in the snow, their worn boots providing little protection. Against the harsh terrain they had traversed, the general knew that retreat was now impossible. They'd committed themselves to a path that led either to victory or annihilation. The surprise attack on Trenton succeeded brilliantly, catching the Hessian garrison completely off guard during their post-Christmas celebrations. Raoul himself was mortally wounded while attempting to rally his troops, and within an hour, the Continental Army had captured nearly 1,000 prisoners, along with desperately needed supplies and artillery. The psychological impact of this victory reverberated throughout the colonies, proving that the Continental Army could defeat European professionals under the right circumstances. But Washington understood that one victory, however spectacular, would not be enough to sustain the revolution through the coming trials. The British would respond with overwhelming force, and the Continental Army needed to strike again before their enemies could recover from the shock of Trenton. As his men celebrated their first major triumph in months, the general was already planning their next move, one that would prove even more crucial to the war's ultimate outcome. Major General Charles Cornwallis received word of the Trenton disaster while enjoying a comfortable evening at his New York headquarters. The warmth of his fireplace a stark contrast to the bitter reality now facing British forces in New Jersey. The dispatch arrived via exhausted courier who had ridden through the night, his horse's hooves thundering against frozen ground as he carried news that would shatter British confidence in their inevitable victory. Cornwallis read the report twice, his aristocratic features hardening with each devastating detail of how professional Hessian troops had been routed by what he had dismissed as a rabble of colonial farmers. The general's immediate reaction was one of controlled fury mixed with grudging respect for Washington's audacity. British intelligence had tracked the Continental Army's retreat across New Jersey, noting their dwindling numbers and apparent demoralization with satisfaction that bordered on complacency. The assumption had been that Washington would retreat further into Pennsylvania and perhaps attempt to maintain some semblance of resistance until winter quarters could be established, buying time for diplomacy to end the rebellion through negotiation. Rather than complete military conquest, Cornwallis understood the broader implications of Trenton's fall, with the clarity that marked him as one of Britain's most capable field commanders. The victory would energize colonial resistance at precisely the moment when British strategy depended on crushing rebel morale through an unbroken string of defeats. Loyalist sentiment in New Jersey, carefully cultivated through months of British occupation, would now waver as colonists witnessed the Continental Army's ability to strike effectively against professional European forces. The general immediately began preparations for a massive counteroffensive designed to trap Washington's army and eliminate the Continental forces before they could capitalize on their unexpected success. He assembled a force of 8,000 seasoned troops, including British regulars, Hessian reinforcements, and Loyalist militia units that had been scattered throughout New Jersey. This overwhelming numerical advantage would allow him to pursue multiple strategic objectives simultaneously while ensuring that Washington could not escape through tactical maneuvering. Intelligence reports indicated that Washington had recrossed the Delaware into Pennsylvania following the Trenton victory. But Cornwallis suspected this was merely a temporary withdrawal to consolidate captured supplies and prisoners. The British commander's extensive military experience suggested that Washington would attempt another surprise attack, likely targeting Princeton, where British forces maintained a significant garrison to protect supply lines running between New York and Philadelphia. This analysis proved remarkably prescient, though Cornwallis underestimated the desperate boldness that would characterize Washington's next gambit. On January 1st, 1777, Cornwallis began his advance. From New York, with a confidence born of numerical superiority and professional military training, his forces moved in 3 columns designed to converge on the Delaware River, effectively sealing off Washington's escape routes while maintaining sufficient flexibility to respond to rebel movements. The general's plan called for a methodical advance that would force the Continental Army into a decisive battle where British advantages in training, equipment, and numbers would prove overwhelming. As British forces approached Trenton on January 2nd, they encountered unexpected resistance from Continental outposts that had been established along major approach routes. These delaying actions, though ultimately unsuccessful in stopping the British advance, provided Washington with crucial intelligence about enemy movements while demonstrating the improved discipline and morale that had resulted from the Trenton victory. The psychological transformation of the Continental Army was becoming apparent even to their enemies, who noted the stubborn resistance offered by troops who had been in full retreat. Just weeks earlier, the flickering candlelight in Washington's temporary headquarters cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls as the general studied crude maps of central New Jersey, its weathered fingers tracing potential routes through terrain that would either deliver salvation or seal their doom. The date was January 2nd, 1777, and outside the small farmhouse, his exhausted army huddled around smoking campfires that provided little warmth against the penetrating cold that seemed to freeze the very marrow in their bones. The sound of British artillery echoed in the distance, a constant reminder that Cornwallis was advancing with overwhelming force designed to crush the Continental Army once and for all. Washington's Council of War had convened in desperate circumstances that demanded either genius or madness to overcome. Intelligence reports confirmed that Cornwallis commanded at least 8,000 troops, nearly 4 times the number of effective Continental soldiers available for combat. The British general had positioned his forces to cut off all obvious escape routes across the Delaware, creating what appeared to be an inescapable trap that would end the rebellion through the complete destruction of its only organized military force. The American commander's brilliant mind worked through possibilities that conventional military wisdom would have dismissed as suicidal fantasies. While Cornwallis concentrated his overwhelming strength around Trenton, the British garrison at Princeton remained relatively isolated with fewer than 1,200 defenders. A night march along back roads could potentially bring the Continental Army behind British lines, striking at Princeton before Cornwallis could react to this unexpected maneuver. The plan required perfect execution, absolute secrecy, and considerable luck to succeed against professional soldiers, who had been trained to respond to exactly these kinds of surprise attacks. Colonel Alexander Hamilton, serving as one of Washington's Trusted aides later described the audacious nature of this strategy and correspondence that would be preserved in the Hamilton papers housed at Columbia University. The young officer noted that Washington seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to perceive opportunities that remained invisible to more conventional military minds, transforming desperate circumstances into tactical advantages through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. As midnight approached on January 2nd, Washington's army began their perilous march along the Quaker Road, a little-used route that wound through dense forests and frozen farmland toward Princeton. The soldiers moved in complete silence, their muskets wrapped in cloth to prevent metallic sounds that might alert British patrols to their presence. Many men were barefoot, leaving bloody trails in the snow that marked their passage like a crimson testament to their sacrifice for the cause of independence. The march proved even more challenging than anticipated, with soldiers struggling through deep snow drifts while maintaining the strict discipline necessary to avoid detection. Washington rode among his troops, offering quiet words of encouragement to men who had already endured more hardship than most armies could survive. His presence seemed to infuse the column with determination that transcended their physical suffering, transforming a retreat into what felt like a crusade for freedom itself. By dawn on January 3rd, the Continental Army had covered nearly 12 miles through some of the most difficult terrain in New Jersey. They had successfully bypassed Cornwallis's main force and positioned themselves to strike at Princeton before the British could respond to this unprecedented tactical maneuver. Washington gathered his officers for final preparations, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether their desperate gamble would achieve the impossible or result in the complete annihilation of American hopes for independence. The stage was set for a battle that would reshape the trajectory of the Revolutionary War through the audacious vision of a general who refused to accept defeat. The first pale light of January 3rd, 1777, revealed frost-covered fields surrounding Princeton as Washington's weary army approached the sleeping college town that would soon become the stage for one of the war's most decisive engagements. Captain Alexander Hamilton rode beside his commander, noting how the general's piercing gaze swept across the terrain with the intensity of a predator selecting the perfect moment to strike. The Continental soldiers moved through the pre-dawn darkness like ghosts, their breath-forming clouds that dissipated quickly in the bitter air that cut through their inadequate clothing with merciless efficiency. Washington divided his force into two columns designed to strike Princeton from multiple directions simultaneously, preventing the British garrison from concentrating their defense or organizing an effective counterattack. General Hugh Mercer would lead approximately 350 men along the back road toward the Princeton-Trenton Pike, while Washington himself would command the main assault force approaching the town from the northwest. This tactical arrangement would create confusion among the defenders while maximizing the impact of their surprise attack against professional soldiers who expected to face a retreating rabble rather than a disciplined assault force. The plan began to unfold with clockwork precision as Mercer's advance guard encountered a British patrol near the Thomas Clark farmhouse, just outside Princeton's main defensive perimeter. The initial exchange of musket fire shattered the morning silence like thunder, alerting the entire garrison to the presence of Continental forces in what they had assumed was secure territory. Captain Charles Scott of the British 17th Light Infantry immediately recognized the tactical significance of this engagement, dispatching runners to warn Princeton's defenders while attempting to delay the American advance through defensive action. Mercer's men advanced across the frost-covered field with bayonets fixed, a battle cry echoing across the landscape as they charged toward British positions that had been hastily established behind stone walls and farm buildings. The general himself led from the front, his sword raised high as he urged his troops forward against enemy fire that was beginning to take a devastating toll on the advancing Americans. A British musket ball struck Mercer in the chest, sending him tumbling from his horse as his men wavered in the face of disciplined volleys from professional soldiers who had been trained to break rebel charges through concentrated firepower. The sight of their beloved commander falling seemed to galvanize rather than demoralize the Continental troops, who surged forward with renewed fury that caught the British defenders completely off guard. Private Joseph White of the 3rd Pennsylvania Regiment later recalled how Mercer's fall transformed the battle from a tactical engagement into personal vendetta against enemies who had wounded their general. The Americans fought with a desperation born of months of retreat and defeat. Finally given the opportunity to strike back against forces that had pursued them, across New Jersey like hunting dogs, chasing wounded prey, Washington arrived at the critical moment when Mercer's assault was beginning to falter under heavy British fire. His presence on the battlefield immediately recognizable to soldiers on both sides who had heard legendary accounts of the tall Virginian's courage under fire. The general spurred his white charger directly into the most intense fighting, seemingly oblivious to the musket balls that whistled past his head as he rallied his troops for another assault against British positions. His aide-de-camp, Colonel Fitzgerald, would later write that Washington appeared to bear a charmed life during the Princeton engagement, riding through enemy fire that would have killed a lesser man while inspiring his soldiers to achieve what had seemed impossible just moments before. The tide of battle turned decisively when Captain Hamilton brought his artillery battery into action against the British positions, his cannons loaded with grapeshot that swept the enemy lines with devastating effect. The combination of artillery fire and renewed infantry assault proved too much for the British defenders, who began to retreat toward Princeton in increasingly disorganized fashion. The Continental Army had achieved the impossible, defeating professional European troops in open battle through superior tactics and unbreakable determination that transformed a desperate gamble into a crushing victory that would resonate. Throughout the colonies and across the Atlantic Ocean, the thunder of Hamilton's artillery pieces echoed across the Princeton battlefield as grapeshot tore through British ranks with devastating precision, transforming what had been an organized retreat into something approaching panic among professional soldiers who had never experienced such fierce resistance from colonial forces. Captain William Leslie of the British 40th Foot attempted to rally his men behind the stone walls surrounding Nassau Hall, the college's main building that dominated Princeton's landscape like a fortress overlooking the chaos that had engulfed the peaceful academic town. The British captain's voice carried across the battlefield as he shouted orders that were increasingly difficult to execute against an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every tactical response. Washington pressed his advantage with the instincts of a born warrior, recognizing that hesitation would allow the British garrison to reorganize their defense and potentially reverse the momentum that had cost so much American blood to achieve. The general's white horse carried him directly toward the enemy positions, his sword gleaming in the early morning sunlight as he led a charge that would become legendary in the annals of American military history. Behind him, Continental soldiers advanced with bayonets fixed, their battle cries mixing with the crack of musket fire and the screams of wounded men to create a symphony of warfare that would haunt the memories of survivors for decades to come. The British defense began to crumble as American forces pressed their assault from multiple directions, creating confusion that professional military training could not overcome. When faced with such determined attackers fighting for their very survival, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mohood of the British 17th Foot recognized that his position was becoming untenable, ordering a fighting withdrawal toward the Trenton Road that would allow his surviving troops to link up with Cornwallis's main force. The colonel's tactical acumen prevented a complete disaster for British arms, but could not disguise the fact that a supposedly rabble of colonial farmers had defeated seasoned European troops in open battle, according to contemporary accounts, preserved in the Princeton University archives. The sight of Nassau Hall falling to Continental forces sent shockwaves through the British garrison that had considered the college town an impregnable stronghold. American soldiers surged through the building's corridors, capturing supplies and equipment that would prove invaluable to Washington's perpetually under-equipped army. The symbolic significance of occupying what had been a center of British authority in central New Jersey was not lost on either side, demonstrating that the Continental Army could seize and hold territory against determined enemy resistance. The human cost of victory became apparent as the fighting subsided in both armies began counting their casualties. General Mercer lay mortally wounded near the Thomas Clark farmhouse, his life slowly ebbing away despite the desperate efforts of Continental surgeons who lacked the medical supplies necessary to treat severe battlefield injuries. The general's sacrifice would become emblematic of the price paid for American independence. A reminder that freedom demanded the ultimate sacrifice from those brave enough to challenge the world's most powerful empire. Washington's tactical brilliance had achieved what conventional military wisdom considered impossible. Defeating a professional garrison through superior strategy and unbreakable determination that transformed disadvantage into overwhelming victory. The battle had lasted less than an hour, but its psychological impact would resonate throughout the war as proof that the Continental Army could match European professionals when properly led and motivated. British casualties exceeded American losses by a significant margin, with dozens of prisoners taken along with artillery pieces and supplies that the perpetually under-equipped Continental forces desperately needed. As news of the Princeton victory spread throughout the colonies, it provided the psychological boost that Washington had desperately sought to sustain the revolutionary cause through the dark winter months. The impossible had been achieved through audacious leadership and the courage of soldiers who refused to accept defeat despite overwhelming odds against their survival. The road to Yorktown would prove long and difficult, but Princeton had demonstrated that American independence was more than a distant dream pursued by impractical idealists. The immediate aftermath of Princeton's fall sent shockwaves rippling through British command structures from New Jersey to London. As military professionals struggled to comprehend how their carefully constructed strategy had been shattered by what they had dismissed as an undisciplined colonial rabble, General Cornwallis received word of the disaster while positioned near Trenton. His massive force suddenly rendered irrelevant by Washington's brilliant tactical maneuver that had bypassed British strength to strike at their vulnerable rear positions. The general's aide-de-camp later recalled how Cornwallis stood in stunned silence for several minutes after reading the dispatch, his aristocratic composure finally cracking under the weight of a defeat that challenged everything he believed about colonial military capabilities. The strategic implications of Princeton extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory, fundamentally altering the psychological landscape of the Revolutionary War in ways that would influence every subsequent engagement between British and American forces. Colonial newspapers throughout the 13 colonies trumpeted the victory with headlines that proclaimed Washington's genius and the Continental Army's courage, providing desperately needed morale boost to a population that had watched their cause suffer defeat after defeat throughout the previous months. The Pennsylvania Gazette devoted its entire front page to detailed accounts of the battle, describing how American soldiers had outfought professional European troops through superior tactics and unbreakable determination. Washington understood that Princeton's strategic value lay not merely in the tactical victory achieved, but in its demonstration that the Continental Army could defeat British forces when conditions favored American advantages in mobility and local knowledge. The general immediately began planning follow-up operations, designed to capitalize on the psychological impact of their success while British forces remained confused and demoralized by this unexpected reversal of fortune. Intelligence reports indicated that British garrisons throughout New Jersey were withdrawing toward New York, abandoning territory they had controlled since the previous autumn's campaign. The international ramifications of Princeton proved even more significant than its domestic impact, as European powers who had been skeptical of American military capabilities began to reconsider their positions. Regarding potential alliances with the rebellious colonies, French Foreign Minister Vergennes noted in diplomatic correspondence that Washington's victory demonstrated the Continental Army's potential to sustain effective resistance against British military power, making American independence a realistic possibility rather than a romantic fantasy pursued by impractical revolutionaries. This shift in European perception would prove crucial in securing the foreign assistance that would ultimately prove decisive in achieving American victory. British military strategy required fundamental revision in light of Princeton's lessons. As commanders recognized that conventional European tactics were proving inadequate against an enemy that refused to fight according to established rules of 18th century warfare, the assumption that overwhelming force would crush colonial resistance through a series of decisive battles had been proven false by Washington's ability to avoid destruction while striking at British weaknesses when opportunities presented themselves. Military professionals throughout the British Empire began studying American tactical innovations with grudging respect for an enemy they had previously dismissed as inferior. The personal transformation of Continental soldiers who had participated in the Princeton victory was perhaps the most important long-term consequence of the battle, as men who had been demoralized by months of retreat and defeat suddenly understood that they could match European professionals under the right circumstances. Veterans of the engagement would form the backbone of the Continental Army throughout the remaining years of the war. Their confidence in American military capabilities, providing the foundation for victories that would have seemed impossible just weeks before Princeton. The psychological impact of defeating professional soldiers in open battle created esprit de corps that would sustain the Continental Army. Through the darkest periods of the Revolutionary struggle, Princeton had achieved Washington's primary objective of demonstrating that the cause of American independence remained viable despite the disasters of the previous autumn campaign. The victory provided breathing space necessary for rebuilding the Continental Army while establishing the psychological foundation for continued resistance against British rule. The impossible had been achieved through audacious leadership and the courage of soldiers who refused to accept defeat, transforming the Revolutionary War from a series of colonial defeats into a genuine contest between military equals. The winter quarters established at Morristown following the Princeton victory provided Washington with the breathing space necessary to rebuild the Continental Army. While reflecting on the strategic lessons learned during those desperate January days that had transformed defeat into triumph, the general's correspondence from this period reveals his understanding that Princeton represented more than a tactical success. It had fundamentally altered the character of the Revolutionary War by proving that American forces could achieve the impossible when properly led and motivated by the sacred cause of independence. The snow-covered hills surrounding Morristown bore silent witness to the transformation of a demoralized rabble into a professional military force capable of challenging the world's most powerful empire. The ripple effects of Princeton's psychological impact continued to influence military and political developments throughout 1777. As British commanders struggled to adapt their strategies to face an enemy that had demonstrated unexpected tactical sophistication and unbreakable determination, General Howe's planned campaign against Philadelphia required significant modification to account for the Continental Army's proven ability to strike at British weaknesses while avoiding decisive battles that would favor European professional advantages. The assumption that overwhelming force would quickly crush colonial resistance had been shattered by Washington's brilliant demonstration that inferior numbers could achieve superior results through audacious leadership and tactical innovation. International recognition of American military credibility reached a crucial turning point as European courts received detailed accounts of how Washington's forces had outmaneuvered and defeated seasoned British troops in open battle. The French court at Versailles began serious discussions regarding potential military alliance with the American colonies, recognizing that the Continental Army possessed the tactical sophistication necessary to sustain effective resistance against British imperial power. Spanish and Dutch officials similarly revised their assessments of American military capabilities, opening diplomatic channels that would prove crucial in securing the foreign assistance necessary for ultimate victory. The transformation of American military culture accelerated throughout the months following Princeton, as the victory's psychological impact spread through continental ranks, like wildfire carrying news of liberation from the fear that had haunted colonial forces since the war's beginning. Recruitment improved dramatically as young men throughout the colonies sought to join an army that had proven its ability to defeat professional European soldiers, while desertion rates plummeted among troops who finally believed in their cause's ultimate success. The esprit de corps established during those desperate January days would sustain the Continental Army through the Valley Forge winter and beyond, providing the foundation for victories that would have seemed impossible before Princeton. Washington's personal reputation underwent a remarkable transformation from that of a competent colonial commander to recognition as one of the 18th century's most brilliant military strategists. His tactical innovations at Princeton, studied by military professionals throughout Europe and America, the general's ability to perceive opportunities that remained invisible to conventional military thinking had salvaged the revolutionary cause from apparent disaster, establishing him as the indispensable leader whose vision and courage made American independence possible. His leadership during the Princeton campaign became the template for American military doctrine that emphasized mobility, tactical innovation, and the fighting spirit that could overcome numerical disadvantage. Through superior strategy and determination, the strategic lessons of Princeton resonated throughout the remaining years of the Revolutionary War, as both British and American commanders adapted their tactics to reflect the realities demonstrated during that crucial engagement. British forces could no longer assume that numerical superiority guaranteed victory against an enemy that had proven capable of achieving tactical surprise. Through audacious maneuvering and superior local knowledge, American commanders learned that conventional European tactics could be defeated through innovative approaches that maximized colonial advantages while minimizing the impact of British professional training and equipment superiority. The ultimate significance of Princeton lay not in its immediate tactical results, but in its demonstration that American independence represented more than an impossible dream pursued by impractical idealists. Washington's victory had proven that colonial forces possessed the military capability necessary to challenge British imperial power effectively, transforming the Revolutionary War from a colonial rebellion into a genuine contest between equals that would ultimately result in the birth of a new nation, founded on the principle that free people could govern themselves without kings or nobles. The road from Princeton to Yorktown would prove long and difficult, but the foundation for ultimate victory had been established during those desperate January days when the impossible became reality through the courage of soldiers who refused to accept defeat.